Hello everybody, welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, and my friend, no, that way, Dr. Aaron Adair. Really happy to be chatting with Aaron, and we are going to be discussing, just in case anyone's here for the Ukraine war, we're not going to be discussing the Ukraine war because I know my channel has housed both these sort of topics. We are going to be discussing the Exodus account in the Bible and whether it is historically grounded or whether indeed there are alternative theories for why the story exists, and also Moses, the main protagonist in the story. So we're going to be talking a lot about history, biblical exegesis, probably a bit of language. Linguistic analysis as well, no doubt, will pop in. We have previously spoken on this topic in probably one of my last videos in this field by talking about the name Moses and where it came from. So, Aaron, thanks so much for joining me. What have you been up to?
Well, I've been crazy busy combination of work, other work that I do for my physics research at MIT, doing some language learning stuff, and not only this book project on the Exodus, but fun thing, my wife and I, around my birthday last year, went to go see the most recent Godzilla film out of Japan, and we said, we're going to write a book about this. So we have marathoned all of the Godzilla films, both American and Japanese, and trying to put that together into a collection of essays. And my wife's a PhD in English, so she's got that skill set to apply to this sort of stuff.
Wow, that's pretty mad. Wasn't expecting that. And just to let the audience know, you've also written an article basically for the book, one of the sort of chapters or work you're doing for the book that we're writing. And just to let people know, there's a trilogy of books that I've written. And this is, so I wrote The Nativity, a Critical Examination. Originally, that was my earliest book in a trilogy. Then The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story, and this is the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story, which is a third book in the trilogy. And you are helping by writing half of that. And the content you've been developing, you thought, right, let's see if I can get a journal paper out of this, and you've been accepted, and it's got through peer review. So that's really cool.
Yes, I should mention that I also have a second article that's also going through the process as well, that's hitting another subject. So another philological problem, because one of the major problems with the Exodus story is the magnitude, that the various numbers from the book of Numbers indicates how many men of fighting age were able to flee from Egypt. And you do the basic math and you realize, hey, we're looking at like 2 or 3 million people who left Egypt, which was maybe the entire population of Egypt, hanging out in the desert for 40 years, then invading another country that has at most a carrying capacity of 100,000-ish, and leaving almost no trace. And it's just like, okay, this isn't plausible. So there's all these attempts to try to reinterpret the word for 1,000 as something else. And I go into the attempts to do that. Now, fortunately, other people have already looked and said, hey, grammatically, this makes no sense. But also, a physicist wrote a couple of articles around the year 2000, a little bit before the year 2000, creating a model to explain what's going on there. And I realized, hey, I can do math too. And basically show that that approach fails basic statistical tests for hypothesis testing. And then if you're actually critically analyzing it, you realize, no, these numbers are huge and they're ridiculous. And the article I've written as well that's in peer review right now is going to try to say, here's how you actually develop the size of those numbers through the various sources of the Pentateuch. So starting with stuff in Deuteronomy, later stuff in the J source, and then later in the P source, where you get those big, fantastic, and precise numbers. That seems to be the job of the P source. So trying to explain how the relationship happens and also all these other theories to explain the numbers, they don't work. I can actually mathematically demonstrate they're probably fake.
Right, so that's awesome, amazing. We're going to rewind a little bit. You talk about J source, P source. Let's go right back to the beginning. What we're going to be talking about and how we're going to be sort of parsing it and analyzing it. So we are talking about the Exodus story in the Bible, and this is a super important part of the Bible. Some will argue it is the core to the Bible, really, because it is a lead up to the legal components of the Old Testament, the Torah. So let us know, just give us a brief overview of the story of Exodus as quick as you can, and the story of Moses, and
All
when you
right.
think so what traditional Christians or Jews or even Islamic scholars might think where it's set, when it was set, and who wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the basic story is the descendants of Jacob, also named Israel. He is the forefather of the 12 tribes based on his 12 sons that he had with his wife and concubines and their handmaids. So it's like basically lots of sexy time, lots of kids. They become the ancestors of all the Jewish tribes, and they through some unusual circumstances relating to what happened with their brother Joseph, they all end up living in Egypt. Things are fine for a while. Then a new pharaoh comes along and he says, hey, I'm a jerk, so I'm going to enslave all these people that were previously welcomed. And so you have basically the entirety of the Israelite people in bondage, in slavery in Egypt. They're in this circumstance for several centuries. And then eventually a newborn hero emerges. Literally, he's newborn and has to be rescued as an infant, with a story that sounds really similar to other attempts on heroes' life sorts of stories, but, little details like that for later, we'll talk. This figure is Moses. He's supposed to even get his name from the way he's actually rescued from the water in the first place. He grows up in the household of Pharaoh, then sees how his people are treated, bangs the head to death of one of those enslavers, runs off to the desert to hide, and eventually accidentally literally runs into the god of the universe out in the desert. And that god says, I'm going to tell you my name, and you're going to go and you're going to free your people, and I'm going to help you because, again, master of the universe, I'm going to get things done. So Moses goes back, says, you better do it or else. A lot of or else happens. And the Jewish people or the Israelites are then on their way from Egypt to returning to the Holy Land, Palestine, Canaan, modern day Israel, many different names for the same territory. The Egyptian pharaoh has multiple back and forth flips of heart, and this last time tries running after this whole army after the fleeing Israelites. And lo and behold, a miracle happens. The Israelites pass through the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh's army gets completely destroyed in that sea when it comes and collapses back in. Hooray, freedom. Then the Israelites are in the desert for 40 years because somebody decided to have a cow, literally, by making the golden calf, worshiping that instead of God. So there's all those years of suffering. Eventually, then the people come in and come into the Holy Land, conquer there, and then set up what will eventually become the kingdoms of David and Solomon, eventually. Now, when does this happen? The Bible does give numbers, but there's a lot of disagreement about how to interpret those numbers. There are some manuscript issues between the Hebrew and the Greek versions of it, but you will find the vast, vast majority of scholars put the Exodus time in what is called the Late Bronze Age. So this will go from very, very roughly 1500 BC to 1100-ish BCE. That range is where you'll find almost everyone place the Exodus. The most traditional date you'll see on evangelical websites is exactly the year 1446 BCE. The more quote-unquote consensus position is it's somewhere in the 13th century, and that's in part because in the Exodus story, it talks about these cities and territories of Ramses. And you can't have like a city of Ramses before there's a pharaoh named Ramses. And the most important pharaoh, but that name is Ramses II, Ramses the Great in the 1200s. So in somewhere in that time frame is where most Egyptologists who believe in an Exodus would place it. And that's where most of the effort has gone looking for the evidence of such an Exodus, or at least an Exodus tradition.
And the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, these are thought to be written by Moses himself. And the
Mhm.
idea, according to traditional Christian scholars or Christians generally, I don't know how many scholars would still adhere to this, is that Moses wrote those books, but then you have all the problems with that, which is, well, how's he writing in a third person? How is he writing and saying he's the humblest man ever in the world? And it's like, really? Like, would he say that about himself if he was humble? And then, writing about across the Jordan as if you're writing from where Israel ends up being, and you're
Mhm.
writing about this story across the Jordan. Well, Moses never crossed the Jordan, so he could never
Right.
write across the Jordan. He was always that side of the Jordan, and so on and so forth. There are lots of reasons, and it also includes his own death, right? So you're never going
Yeah.
to write about your own death. So there are all these reasons to suggest that actually Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. Okay, so that whole account of the story that you've given, virtually every moment of that story can be questioned either externally from the Bible by looking at historical analyses, but also internally from the Bible, from other sources within the Bible that might give us an indication of what the Moses story was, or maybe wasn't, or there's an absence, and so on and so forth. There's basically nothing about the story that really does stand up to historical analysis. And is that, first of all, would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's been my view, that is the wide consensus of people who study this. Those who don't agree with that are usually evangelical or fundamentalists. So any evidence that is against that has to somehow be wrong or be misinterpreted, because one way or another, the Exodus story has to be true. But if you go to the Israel Antiquity Authority, their consensus position is this didn't happen. At most, there was maybe some small escapes of slaves that somehow that developed into this tradition. That's usually the most you will get as the Exodus from critical scholars.
Yeah, and of course the idea is that there's motivated reasoning going on there. So motivated reasoning means that you have reason to believe something other than the justification from the thing in and of itself. So Christians or Orthodox Jews would be motivated to believe in its truth, because if it's not true, then basically the whole of the Bible starts crumbling, because it's kind of built. The Bible it is sort of almost like a pyramid, should we say, to be quite apt, as it is a pyramid, and you start pulling out the foundations, the whole thing starts crumbling down. And that's precisely why I've written those 2 first books of the trilogy, and this third book is so important, because if you start picking apart the historicity of Jesus's birth in the nativity and say, well, historically that didn't happen, and here's all the reasons it didn't happen, then you look at the resurrection, where that intersects. So the only 2 points of Jesus's life that intersect with his history, the rest in the middle, all his kind of itinerant preacher stuff, is unverifiable, because it's just there are no historical markers at all, so you can't disprove or prove it at all. But either ends of his life you can, because there are historical markers, and actually by looking at those and analyzing them, and also looking at the context, like burial rituals, and that we know historically, and so on and so forth. Okay, the resurrection didn't happen like it was claimed in the gospel. So the birth didn't happen, the death didn't happen, or certainly didn't happen like was claimed. And
Mhm.
and these are all built. This is the top of the pyramid. So you got the life of Jesus is built on all these other things. And when you've got Jesus saying every jot and tittle of the law will be fulfilled in me, then we need to go and look at the every jot and tittle of the law. So where does the law come from? We're talking about the Mosaic law, and then we're talking about Moses, and we're talking about the Exodus. Okay, so if this is what the Old Testament is about, the Torah, the Jewish Bible, then and the Christian Bible, the New Testament, or certainly the New Testament thereof, is built on that. We start finding that the Exodus didn't happen, then what does this say about everything else? And it all starts tumbling down like a house of cards or a badly built pyramid. Right, sorry. So that's why this is important. So okay, that's the story of Moses and the story of the Exodus in a very brief synopsis. Is there anything else you want to add before getting stuck in?
Just if you want to bring up the screen I'm sharing, it'll kind of lay out like how I'm trying to organize what we'll try to chat about. So we've already described what is supposed to be the story of, big man Moses doing these things and bringing the law to the people. But now we'll go into what is the evidence for, or maybe not for, that. And I think what is most interesting to me is, where does this tradition come from? Historical or not? How does it actually come about? And can we actually trace the evolution of the story or the tradition? Get into the various sources, how they relate to each other, and then we'll cap it off with what is my most recent research that has been accepted through peer review.
That sounds brilliant. And we will be talking about, so we mentioned that Moses, according to traditional Christian and Jewish understanding, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but he didn't for all these reasons. And one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why we know that is because of doing sort of source analysis and so on and so forth, and form criticism and everything. We can look at the texts itself. I was going to say the texts themselves, because actually the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, are clearly not written by a single source, but by multiple sources. So when Aaron was talking earlier on about J and P, depending on what theory you believe in, there may be 4 sources, J, E, D, P, and an editor. This is called the documentary hypothesis, and we'll be talking about that, I presume, in the sources for Exodus in the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Lots and lots to talk about. Start us off then.
All right. So let's start off with all of the archaeological evidence people can point to and say this is positively indicative of the Exodus. So I'm going to list out all of the direct positive evidence that we need to assess.
Yeah, as soon as you started saying that, I knew where that was going.
Now, there are bazillions of Christians who will try to, point to things and say, hey, there were Semitic people in Egypt. Yes. Does that mean they left in the millions? No. There's no positive indication of that particular thing. This is literally what we would point to. Now, a lack of evidence may not necessarily be strong. There are strong and weak versions of the argument from silence. So let's see what the actual argument is. So here's what I think might actually be, in many ways, just the knockdown death punch to the entire idea of an Exodus, is that we know what parts of the world were under control by Egypt at the time. So specifically, we're looking at the late Bronze Age, like I say, from roughly 1500 to roughly 1100 BCE. And throughout a huge chunk of that time, and all the times that basically everyone suggests an Exodus, is when the Holy Land was under direct Egyptian control. The Pharaoh Tutmosis III basically came in with armies and conquered first in Megiddo and then went up into Syria and basically expanded the Egyptian borders extremely far north even of modern day Israel. And Egypt held control of that land until the days of Ramesses III, so roughly into about 1150 BCE. And we can confirm that through archaeological findings. So we can actually dig in the ground and say, hey, here's a scarab with this pharaoh's name on it. Here's all these Egyptian potteries or weapons, administrative items. And you just see that through layers and layers through the centuries. We even also have literary evidence. So, for example, the Armano letters, where we have literal letters between the governors of various cities in the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, writing back to the Pharaoh and say, oh, super terrific, wonderful Pharaoh, how much we love you. Could you help us out with this little issue we have here because you're so magnanimous? And we see this through the 15th century, through the 14th century, into the 13th century. And even into the 12th century, you have Egyptian armies basically zipping up and down through the Holy Land like it's nothing until basically what is called the Bronze Age collapse.
So okay, right. We have a period of time where, according to let's call them Christian scholars, but that's a shortcut for biblical scholars, or biblical scholars. That's probably better because that would include Jewish scholars. Okay, biblical scholars will say that are maximalists, that are wanting it to be true, are saying that it happened between this point and this point. But history tells us between this point and this point that the Egyptians actually controlled the Holy Land, which is where one would assume the Canaanites were supposed to exist for the Exodus to move into that land. Is that correct? So even that doesn't really work with the story as is set out.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably the biggest thing is that the whole idea is that the Jews, or the Israelites, I should say, are trying to escape Egypt. and they basically have escaped Egypt to go into other Egypt. It would be like saying you were trying to escape the tyranny
Right.
of the King of England, and so you run away and you get out of the United Kingdom by going to Edinburgh. I'm sorry, you're still under the crown. You moved, yes, but still, Scotland Yard is still on your tail. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So there are just problems everywhere you look, right?
Yeah, and we also know, like, we have the earliest mention of a people group called Israel in what's called the Meneptah Stele from 1208 BCE, approximately. And this is talking about the pharaoh Meneptah basically doing all sorts of military conquests, including into the Holy Land, and apparently wiping the floor with a people group there called Israel. So that indicates, okay, there's a people group there called that, but it also shows the Egyptians are able to march through like it's nothing and take control of the place. Even later pharaohs are able to go in and take people from the Holy Land and bring them to Egypt as slaves. So during the time that the Exodus was supposed to happen and the Israelites are free, there are anti-exodoi happening at that same time.
Yes,
so it's the exact opposite of the tradition.
and it's also worth noting that those slaves that you were just talking about are only sort of one or two or several, or not the sorts of numbers we're talking about in the Exodus account. So there are, is it part of the Amana letters where they're talking about what should we do with this slave that was found escaping from Israel? And we're not talking about thousands, we're literally talking about one or two that were found in the outpost.
It's actually it's after the Armada period, but yeah, you have basically this person who's tracking two runaway slaves and literally is on their trail and getting updates as they're going past the various not guard posts but outposts that the Egyptians have in the Negev desert into Canaan proper. And it's basically like, yeah, these people are running away and they're just outside the reach of the law, but they're being tracked the whole time. We don't know their final fate, but we can also see, hey, the Egyptians are able to control or monitor what's going on their borders to such a degree that even two people can be tracked down. And somehow 3 million people escaped everyone's notice.
Yes, and of course we'll come on to that later, and probably come on to this later. But the idea that there is evidence that one or two slaves did escape, and there were letters being sent back to the Egyptian central kind of authorities saying, well, what should we do about this, could be a kernel of truth to the eventual Exodus story, whereby some tribe may have someone coming back to them saying, yay, Jimmy and Harry came back from being enslaved, and then that becomes a story, and it kind of, that kernel is added to and eventually gets mythologized. And you could argue that the telephone game or Chinese whispers or whatever, it then becomes this myth of Exodus. That is one sort of tenuous, I guess, theory.
And I'm actually going to be arguing against that particular idea because, again, the Holy Land was still under Egyptian control. So there were still slaves in the Holy Land under Egyptian control. So you weren't escaping slavery. It wasn't like in the antebellum days here in the US where you could escape from the southern states to the north. It would be like escaping from Mississippi to Louisiana. You're still in a slave state. That's kind of what would be going on there. You'd have some different governors, but you're still under the whip. So where that tradition actually comes from, I'll be discussing my current hypothesis there.
Okay, well, I'll let you continue then, and I'll just sup happily from my wine.
All right. So the other big thing is, hey, if hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are fleeing, they should have left some trash along the way. The way that we can trace people through the centuries through archaeology is by what they leave behind. And lots of people are very messy. And to make it so that thousands of people living in the desert for decades don't even drop a jar for an archaeologist to find is hard to believe. And archaeologists have tried to go through and looked in the wilderness, in the desert, for any evidence of that people group of Israel being there waiting before they can come into the Holy Land. Now, the Christian apologists might come back and say, hey, it's a huge desert. How are you supposed to find where they might have been. Just because you looked under this like one pile of rocks and didn't find anything doesn't mean there's no evidence at all. That's a really weak argument from silence. And also, they'll say like, hey, these various Bedouin groups, they move from day to day and leave almost nothing behind. There's no like significant settlement that you can find. And that's part of the excusegetics that exists to talk that away. But it doesn't work so well because the Bible explicitly mentions one location called Kadesh Barnea, and the Israelites aren't there just for like an overnight stay. The book of Deuteronomy itself says they stayed there for many days, and depending on how you read the other sources, they might have spent basically 38 of the 40 years in that one location. And we are talking about a huge population, according to the biblical tradition, all in that one location, living and dying in that spot.
Several things to say here. So one, let it be understood that 40 years that they were supposed to be wandering around Kadesh Barnea or surrounding areas is going to be a symbolic number. So it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. You know, Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, pretty much to simulate the 40 years in the wilderness here. But 40, there are all sorts of different 40s. I forget all the different 40s in the Bible, but it is a very symbolic number. So it's unlikely that they were actually doing this for 40 years. And it might have been just sheer fluke that everyone does everything for 40 years or 40 days, but it's unlikely. But nonetheless, the idea is that they're there for an awful long time, and there is ample archaeological evidence of contemporaneous Bedouin tribes, people doing I believe there's evidence of them doing your normal Bedouin tribey kind of things, but no evidence of millions of people doing the living with, when you're going to be having livestock to support you, you're going to have your families to support you. So this isn't just the men folk from Egypt. There's huge numbers of people and animals. Now, I think it's probably worth mentioning a valid argument from silence here. So an argument from silence that is, I guess, unsound would be, I don't know. You tell me that you went to the shops, you bought a Mars. You went to the shop yesterday at 3 o'clock. You bought a Mars bar. You came back. You ate the Mars bar, and like, okay, I've got no evidence you ate that Mars bar. There's no wrapper. There's no, just because there's no evidence that you ate that Mars bar and went to the shop doesn't mean it didn't happen. So it's not very sound. But the problem with arguments from silence is that sometimes they are really good arguments, and the argument would be that if you expect evidence to be there and the evidence isn't there, then that is actually disconfirming evidence of that original claim. So for example, if you said, hey, and let's say we live together in Fareham here, and you said, hey, you're back off holiday, Johnny. Well, last night there was an earthquake, 7.5 on a Richter scale, and absolutely mental. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. And then I go out the next day and I look around and there's no destruction. And I go and speak to people and no one knows anything about this. And no buildings are down. There's nothing on the news. Then I would expect there to be evidence of a earthquake of a 7.5 on a Richter scale. And if there is no evidence of that, where I would expect them to be evidence, then I am justified in disbelieving your claim, because actually the lack of evidence in this case is disconfirming. So there are different arguments from silence. Sometimes it is not a good argument to use an argument from silence, but sometimes, and I think this is a perfect example, if there is no archaeological evidence of millions of people existing for 40 years in this wilderness where you would absolutely expect evidence to be, then it is evidence that it didn't happen. Sorry to go on for so long.
Yeah, and that's extremely good and on point. And the main things is we should expect there to be evidence, because the Bible talks about all sorts of things that the Israelites had with them that leave an archaeological record. It says they brought pots and pans. Those can stay in the desert for thousands of years. They apparently brought the equipment to do goldsmithing, to make that golden calf. That's stuff that's going to, stick around. It's also a major burial site, because according to number 16, literally over 14,000 people died at this particular site due to plagues and other things. And so, hey, that's a lot of dead bodies to get buried. You'd think we'd find, a mass grave if that were the case. And we can find the site. We know the site well. We've identified it. We've done a lot of archaeology. We can find findings from after the Late Bronze Age and from before the Late Bronze Age. So we find stuff from the Middle Bronze Age. We find stuff from the Iron Age. But for the Late Bronze Age, the time of the Exodus, it's completely empty. I have this quote here from Bill Deaver, famous archaeologist, and basically focusing here on the 13th or 12th centuries, and saying not even a potsherd are found.
Sorry, I want you to say that quote, but was William Deaver? As I explained to you before we went live, like I've been so deeply in the Ukraine war that all my knowledge has been pushed out my brain. But William Deaver, was he originally quite a maximalist, as in he thought that the Bible was extensively shown to be true from archaeology, and then it's moved towards a more minimalist position that actually no.
He
I
has moved. Yeah, so he's definitely moved more towards minimalism, but he was never a maximalist in the same way like a fundamentalist was.
Yeah.
So he always agreed that that the Exodus story is overblown, if not completely fiction, that the conquest is completely unevidenced. It was more a question of what sorts of things can we reconstruct about the past, and how much does the Bible actually is useful as a source for the past. And yeah, he's become more and more closer to the minimalist camp with time, though he wouldn't call himself a minimalist in the way others would, where
Philip Davis and people like that. Yeah.
But nonetheless, he is an archaeologist trained there, and as he points out in this, and I checked other archaeological reports for the same spot, and they basically agree, for the entire Late Bronze Age, there's nothing. As Deaver puts it here, is there just not even a potsherd from the expected time period. So millions of people living here for decades, tens of thousands of people dying here, and they left nothing. So either they really cleaned up well, more than any other human ever has, or it didn't happen.
And what's interesting about all of these points is that I would argue that each one of these points is fairly terminal in itself. Like this point alone, in my opinion, is enough to throw out the Exodus account, at least, in large part. And when you find that actually this is a kind of argument that can be applied to every single point of the Exodus story, then you are left thinking it is largely mythological. There's a point sorry, I'm probably derailing you here, Aaron, but
go.
I was listening back to the sort of documentary from Myth Vision that you and I helped a little bit with, Derek Lambert's Myth Vision, and because I needed to just do a little bit of genning up on the subject because it's been so long. And there was an interesting part where he talked about the mythological tropes. And I don't know if this is pertinent to only, say, Hellenic hero stories or hero stories in general. But he's saying there's something like 23 elements of the classic hero story. And the Moses story has something like 21 of them, or 22 out of I forget how many it is.
Yeah. The hero archetype that was identified by Lord Ragland in the 1930s, and he based it on the story of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus of Thebes, and had this 22-point criteria, and Moses is almost as good as Oedipus himself in matching this pattern. So it's like he's like the most mythological person in all of mythology.
Yeah, so if you were going to start from scratch and write a hero mythological story, heroic mythological story, then, the Moses story looks exactly like it has been written to be a hero story. It ticks every single element or classical tropish element of these sorts of stories. So I thought that was quite interesting. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Oh yeah. So this is like, the archaeologists go in and can't find the evidence that's expected. And this is just one of many other places, but this is just a really good, I think, powerful example because it's a well-identified site in the Bible. The Bible itself says they spent a lot of time there. It was like their main hub. It's where messages came to and went out, where spies came to and went out. Tens of thousands of people were supposed to have died and been buried there. And it's just the only thing you can find from the Bronze Age is the wind. There's literally no archaeological finds for that period. So it's pretty darn definitive. But hey, when I discovered when it comes to evidence against the Exodus, I feel like it's those infomercials. But wait, there's more. How about
Absolutely.
there is no Israel as we understand it of that time? Now, there is a people group called Israel in circa 1208 BCE. We have that in the Egyptian written Mneptah stele. So there was a people group in the Holy Land somewhere calling themselves Israel at that time. So we know there's some sort of people group there, but let's back up. Israel is supposed to be the namesake of Jacob. He had his name changed after wrestling with God and changed his name to Israel, which allegedly means struggle with God, wrestle with God, because he had a wrestling match. And Israel then has all these kids that become the various tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And the thing is, we can do some digging and wonder, where's the evidence for those tribes? And I'm just going to show a few examples here of things that don't match the story. So
Can I just interrupt to say, just in case people don't know what a stele is, it is
yes.
a stone, kind of like an obelisk, sort of stone slab with inscriptions on it. So that's what it is.
Yeah, you have a smooth surface and then you inscribe your really super important message. In this case, for Pharaoh Merneptah, the stone that basically said, I, Merneptah, am so darn awesome, and here's all the reasons why I'm so awesome. Obviously in more flowery language, but that's the basic idea. So you have all these tribes of Israel, and they were all supposed to have lived in Egypt as slaves together, and then all left Egypt together in the Exodus. But the weird thing is, when we try looking for those tribes, what fragments of evidence we have for them, there are all sorts of weird incongruities. So, for example, Asher is supposed to be one of the major, more northern tribes. And we actually have Egyptian records of a territory called Asher in Canaan, corresponding to the traditional location. But here's the thing. This means that there is a group, or there's a region called Asher, living and existing separately from Israel. It's like Asher has been its own thing, and Israel is a Johnny-come-lately, completely separate from any Exodus tradition. Again, we have Asher existing in the Holy Land before the Exodus was supposed to even have happened. That's a weird thing. And again, this isn't for a people group called Asher or the descendants of Asher, one of the sons of Israel, but it's a territory name just like Megiddo or Philistine territory, things like that. It's some sort of town or land place name. That's already something that doesn't match the tradition.
Right, yeah, so another nail in the coffin.
Yeah. And I'm only going through a few here. In the book that I'm working on, I think I've put the nail in the coffin for 6 of the 12 tribes of where we can actually have some evidence. The tribe of Dan is a bit interesting because where Dan is supposed to be located is not consistent. There's a town called Dan, which is the most northern city in ancient Israel. And it's this, way up north, it's landlocked. And we have archaeological records from there showing that it was destroyed by some sort of fire or some sort of attack on there around 1000 BCE. But we look at the kinds of finds from before and after that, and it looks like it's the same people living there before and after. So some disaster happened and the same sorts of people moved in. This doesn't look like an invasion from the outside. It's also much later than when the conquest is supposed to be. And the city being so far north also is inconsistent because other parts of the Bible describe Dan as on the coast. It's on the Mediterranean Sea coast. You find that, for example, in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which is considered probably the oldest part of the entire Bible, the Song of Deborah. And it seems to suggest that Dan is on the coast. It's a people that are on boats. There are no boats in the city of Dan. There's no place to boat around. So it's a bit weird. And there's also this interesting little connection that Dan in Hebrew also might be close to a Greek word of a people group called the Danoi. These are actually mentioned among the sea peoples that are attacking Egypt at the end of the Bronze Age. It's also a name for the Greeks in Homer. So the descendants of Danius are the Danoi, and these are supposed to be some of the earliest Greek groups. And it'd be interesting to say, hey, are these Dan people actually Greeks? And here's the light bulb moment. You probably only know one person from the Bible of the tribe of Dan, and that's Samson, who's basically the Jewish version of Hercules.
Right.
So if the Danoi become the Danites and they take some sort of early Hercules tradition with them, that might explain why Samson is a Danite rather than any other tribe.
And we don't want to go down the whole Samson is a solar myth thing,
Yeah.
because that is, I mean, we do, because I'd love that, but we would digress. But there's
Yeah.
another story that has absolutely no historical basis and looks like an entirely looks like a myth. But anyway.
Oh yeah. It's a very weird, messy story, to say the least, especially if you're a Philistine. It's very messy.
Yeah.
But it would make some sense that if the tribe of Dan is originally some outside, maybe Greek group. Wait, this is uncertain. It's a bit speculative, but it is something actively investigated by modern scholars and archaeologists.
Right.
So it's a live option in the scholarship today. And at the very least, the Bible's inconsistent. It doesn't really match the archaeology of who the Danites were supposed to be or where they were supposed to have lived, because it's giving two different locations for them, and there's a bunch of anachronisms for the city of Dan existing in the first place. But I'm going to skip past that to probably the big issue I see, the tribe of Judah, because Judah, it's where we get the word Judaism ultimately. And according to the censuses from the book of Numbers, Judah was supposed to be the largest of the 12 tribes. And there have been all these surveys across all of modern day Israel to basically go around and figure out, well, just how many settlements have been in this country over the centuries, and do these large surveys and basically see what parts were populated and when. Judah, like I say, was supposed to be the most populous, and the book of Numbers basically says, all right, Judah, you're the biggest, you get the biggest chunk of territory, you get all these cities. But if you go to the archaeological record, at the time of the Exodus, at the end of the late Bronze Age, the number of settlements in Judah is 0. Not just a few, actually 0.
So this means that the end of the Exodus account is completely ahistorical as far as understanding, where all these people were supposed to be, so on and so forth. At least
it would even suggest that these people basically, as the people that they are described in the Bible, didn't even exist. There weren't even any Judeans yet.
Yeah.
We only start seeing any settlements in Judea in the early Iron Age, and there's like 4 settlements by the end of Iron 1. So Judah, instead of being the largest and most populous tribe, for the longest time was actually one of the smallest and weakest ones, until basically the fall of the northern tribe, or the northern kingdom, in the 8th century. So much, much, much later.
And I don't know whether it's worth saying this now. Is it worth mentioning about the Exile, just to give a sense of where the traditional understanding of the Moses chronology fit, in terms of the history of the exile of the Jews, if you want to call them that, because I never quite know what to call the peoples, because there are so many different times, think Israelites, but then Israel didn't exist. And anyway, so you had the exile that pushed a whole load of people out, and then the idea was that they didn't have a history in exile. They were kind of feeling a bit lacking in identity, and so there are many theories that will state that the Bible, that the Hebrew Bible was written as a reaction to having no history, as a kind of like an attempt to create an identity, and that was written in exile. And of course, that was far later, in the sort of 500-600s BCE.
Yeah, 500s, 400s, even into the maybe the 300s.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as a number of Bible scholars have been putting it, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible we have, it is a Judean project. It's a Judean artifact, rather than a Northern Israelite creation. There are Northern Israelite traditions in the Bible, but they've ultimately been rewritten and spun by the Southern neighbors, who always felt, or at least for a long time, felt like the little brothers being picked on, until their northern brothers got picked on by a much bigger bully in the 8th century.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, continue there. So
All right.
we're on to
So,
the
okay. So there's no evidence for any independence in Canaan at the appropriate time. There's no evidence for a large group of people moving between Egypt and the Holy Land. There's no evidence for the tribal organization. How about I also tell you there's no evidence that God existed at this time? Because here's the thing. The name of God, Yahweh, is actually found in Egypt. We have it in several inscriptions, starting in like the 14th century BCE. But it's not the name of a god. Yahweh to the Egyptians is the name of a territory that is populated by a group of nomadic people known as the Shasu. So there are all these different Shasu lands that they refer to in their monuments. The Egyptians refer to them. And among the various Shasu lands, there's a Shasu land Yahweh. So basically, it'd be like American region in New York City, or America region, Rhode Island. That's what the Egyptians seem to be describing in these inscriptions. So this is a drawing from one of these columns at a temple from Amenhotep III, 14th century pharaoh. And I have circled there in red the hieroglyphs that refers to Shasuland Yahweh, among other territories that were all under Egyptian either direct control or in their sphere of influence. And we find these sorts of inscriptions in the writings from Amenhotep III, Ramses II, even Ramses III into the 12th century. And this must be well after the time of the Exodus. The Egyptians only know this word Yahweh as a territory name, not as a god, which also means if the master of the universe came with Moses and basically said, this is the name of our God, and he's going to kick your butts with these multiple plagues, and the Egyptians don't even remember the name of this God, or that it even is a God name, is not just unexpected, it shows that at this time, Yahweh isn't even considered a deity yet.
So this is a really interesting argument that I love to use concerning the historicity of the Exodus account, and that is that if God did come down, because the whole of the plagues and the killing of the Egyptian soldiers at the Red Sea is a show of power. It says that explicitly in the text, right? So this is God flexing basically to the Egyptians. So the whole point of this is to say to the Egyptians, look what I can do. You don't believe in me, essentially. I suggest you believe in me because I am super bloody powerful. And if you mess with me, you're all going to die. I've already killed your firstborn. I've done this. I've done that. Okay, there's no evidence of any of that happening. There's no evidence of the firstborn dying, etc., etc. But as an idea, you would expect that if that had happened, then the Egyptians would have gone, right, here are all the gods we believe in. Oh my God, we've all just been half murdered. Half of us have been murdered. And we now definitely know who really is the most powerful God. Even if we believe in a whole panoply of gods, this is the one. Yet there is absolutely no evidence that they believe. Like you mentioned, you only mentioned Yahweh is a physical place. And so the idea that this happened, but then, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that happened. And then straight away afterwards, literally straight away, everyone went, oh, well, that was fun, wasn't it? Anyway, Osiris, isn't it? Yeah, Isis, isn't it? Yeah. They're all really cool. I love a bit of Seth and etc., etc. Like completely forgotten about, and there's no evidence of Judaism at all, and belief in Yahweh until what was it, the 600s or something, when there was a diaspora community of Jews that moved into Egypt, I think, or something like that. So.
At least that's where we have a prominent group of Jews living in southern Egypt at Elephantine. But there were almost certainly Jews living there before then. For example, the prophet Jeremiah, during the exile, moved to Egypt, and that's where he lived his last days, at least according to the book of Jeremiah.
Yeah, but as far as kind of extant evidence,
Yeah.
the Elephantine papyri, so on and so forth. We there is no evidence of Judaism existing as far as Egypt is concerned,
Yeah.
until like
Or even more
600.
so, this has been a monumental book in my studies that came out just a couple of years ago, The Origins of Israel by Yonatan Adler, basically
Right.
arguing that what we understand as Judaism, following like all the Torah restrictions and that does not appear to become normative until the 2nd century BC.
So this is super important. That actually links to what we've just sort of mentioned. So you mentioned elephantine. The elephantine papyri are these sets of documents that were found that date, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sorry, I'm ill prepared for this, but at 600-ish BCE. And
A bit later than that. It's mostly the 5th and 4th century, and it's during the time when the Persians are controlling Egypt.
Even more problematic. So, so you have these documents that are written by Jews that indicate that there is no, as you say, no normative belief system of Judaism. In fact, it's kind of polytheistic and syncretistic. They've taken ideas of other belief systems and they still believe in this. And they have no knowledge, interestingly, no knowledge of the Moses story, no knowledge of all of the big figures of the Hebrew Bible. It's just absolutely insane that you've got these documentation of Jewish believers that have no knowledge of like the Hebrew Bible and the Orthodox Judaism.
Yeah, they have their own temple, even though, according to the Pentateuch, there should be only the temple is centralized in Jerusalem, but they got their own temple where they worship Yahweh among other gods. This is also a recent bit of publication from Gad Bernea, another archaeologist who mostly focuses on the Persian era. The Elephantine people there, they had not just priests, they had priestesses operating in the temple. And that is very different than like, oh, all the priests of the Jewish people, they need to come from the line of Aaron. It is completely patrilineal. It's like, well, then what are these ladies doing?
Yeah, so like what's important there, I think the Elephantine papyri are insanely important for showing us that that the claims of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, are just they it couldn't have been written when it was written, and it certainly wasn't widespread in its belief. And in fact, that belief didn't exist until far, far, far later in time than people give credit for. So anyway, back to where you were.
Yeah, back to God himself. So I want to highlight a book here in particular. It's relatively recent by Daniel Fleming, Yahweh Before Israel. So already a pretty provocative title, and going through the evidence that we have for the name Yahweh, that it originally is not a divine name, and it only starts actually becoming evidently a divine name by the 9th century BCE. So this is well after the Exodus time, well after the conquest, even after the times of David and Solomon, that we finally have like hard evidence that Yahweh is a god. And how the transition happened is still hard to figure out, but it looks like that ultimately Yahweh went from the name of a territory to the name of a people group based on a fictive kinship idea, to ultimately then fictive kinship by relationship to a deity of that name. There are similar things with like the Moabites and their relationship to their god Chemosh, where they're themselves as a people can be considered a people of a god or a god people. And it seems like that kind of tradition might explain how Yahweh went from territory name to family or familiar name to deity name.
Yeah, so the people from there were associated with a belief, and yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's very technical, the book, I have to say, and there's going to be plenty of scholars that are going to argue about the details because it's very complex. But the main points are we have evidence from Egypt that the name had no association with the supernatural, and we only see that finally changing in the archaeological record when we get to the Mesha Stele, when the king of Moab comes in, messes up the Israelite kingdom, and takes the territory back. And that's the first clear mention of Yahweh in stone that we can point to, and as Yahweh as a god. So somewhere in that 300-year period between the 12th century and the 9th century, that's when the God was finally there. Before that, literally Yahweh was the God who wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if there's no Yahweh, there is no Yahweh saving his people.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Interesting.
All right. So we got ourselves a tradition. And I guess that can eventually get us to our friend Moses, right? Or the Exodus tradition broadly. So what I've tried to do is I'm following a strategy that another scholar started doing back in the 80s, Niels Peters Lemke, who is one of the major minimalist scholars out there and is trying to trace the traditions of Israelite origins by looking at the sources that are more clearly datable, in this case, the prophets. Because the prophets are living in a particular place and time. They actually have things in there that date themselves. In the case of Ezekiel, he'll even say like what specific year he's having his visions.
Can you explain who the prophets are for those who are watching that might not? So you've got the prophets, the kings, so on, like how the Hebrew Bible is constructed.
Yeah, so the prophets are basically supposed to be the spokespeople for God, for Yahweh, for Adonai. And they are supposed to basically say, hey, I'm getting the word of God and I am relating it to you so that way you can get right with the Almighty, whether it's to correct on moral things, on political things, correct worship, or terrible things are going to happen. Here's why. And if you even want to have a chance of redemption, here's what you're going to do. That's the sort of things these prophets do. And there's a few different ways to like break them apart. One of them is looking at them through time. So there are three major time brackets that the prophets will fall into: the pre-exilic period, the exilic, and post-exilic. And here the exile is the exile by the Babylonians. So in the early 6th century BCE, the Babylonian Empire comes in and it said, I've had enough of this rebellious kingdom of Judea, and I'm going to come in, destroy their city, destroy their temple, and bring basically all of their top minds and bring them out of the Holy Land and bring them to Babylon to work for me, to integrate there and basically break apart that culture. This exile lasts for several decades, and the reason it ultimately ends is because the Babylonians themselves get completely annihilated as a political entity by the Persians coming in. And the Persians have this religious toleration, allow Judean folks to return from exile back to the Holy Land. And so these three periods are describing what are considered extremely important parts of Jewish history. And also when I say Jewish history that we can confirm in the archaeological record.
And of course, what I was saying earlier is that this is the exilic period that could have been when the Bible was actually penned as a form of striving for an identity. So that's a lot of scholarship at the moment is moving towards an exilic and even post-exilic construction of the Bible, and that doesn't play well with biblical maximalists and traditionalists who think, well, Moses wrote the book 1,000 years before, the Bible almost 1,000 years before this, and you're saying, well, actually, there's no evidence of that took place. Here are all the problems, all the evidence against Exodus actually having happened at all, and it looks like the Bible was at least in large part constructed during and after the exile, with some parts, as your analysis here with regard to the prophets shows, you've got some elements of some existing writing happening before the exile, some at the time of the exile, and all these people existing at that time, and then after the exile. And of course then we have editors as well, and other, all this gets smashed together into one supposedly coherent narrative. But anyway, carry on.
Right. Yeah. And the things I want to highlight here with the list of the prophets that I have here. So there are some complications to note. So for one thing, these books have gone through a few editions, let's put it, especially the book of Isaiah. It's usually split into three parts. The first 39 chapters is usually called First or Proto-Isaiah. And that is, at least a good chunk of it, is perhaps from the time or from the pen of Isaiah himself, or at least somebody at that time of Isaiah. Then you have what's called Deutero-Isaiah, which is the next several chapters, which was written at the tail end of the exilic period. And then you have another third part called Third or Tritio Isaiah, where there's again somebody glomming on a few extra chapters or other bits of people saying, oh, I'm Isaiah too, and here's my other new super duper prophecy that was totally written in the 8th century.
Yeah.
And the thing that you have to be careful is, okay, we can probably figure out that some things were added in later than other parts, some things are interpolated, and I'm going by things that are either well established in the field or at least are probable in the field of things that are interpolated to highlight. So here are the main observations. If you go back to the earliest prophets from the Northern Kingdom, from Israel, there is a tradition about an exodus. So Amos and Hosea are the oldest of the prophets in the Bible, and they show an Exodus tradition, but they never mention Moses. Conversely, at about the same time in the Southern Kingdom, in Judah, where you have Isaiah, where you have Micah, and other prophets, they don't even know the Exodus tradition, let alone Moses. It looks like the only people who know about an Exodus are in the Northern Kingdom, and that doesn't change until pretty much the very end of the exile period, where the Northern Kingdom is destroyed, Israelites have moved into Judah, and only one of those Judean prophets will even relate anything related to an Exodus tradition. And that's Jeremiah, who is himself a Benjamite, so he's on the border between Israel and Judah from the old times. And I'll also note, he is also using the book of Hosea for his sourcing. So a lot of it is actually straight up copy-pasted from Hosea and then going from there. So the reason he knows about the Exodus is because of that.
So you're saying that the Exodus tradition and the Moses tradition are two separate things, and then they get integrated together over time as peoples came together with those two different traditions.
Yeah, and I would say even much later, because we don't have any Moses tradition that we can be sure existed in the pre-exilic period. So I have a couple things here in gold here, one from Jeremiah 15:1 and from Micah 6:4. And I have them in gold, but I also have them with question marks because there's good reason to suspect that they're actually interpolations, that they are perhaps, or at least probably, I would say probably not original to the book. And once you've removed those two things, you have nothing about Moses in any pre-exilic prophetic writing. So Moses is just, he's extremely absent. When you get into the exilic period and you have prophets like Ezekiel and Deutero-Isaiah, they are definitely aware of and talking about an Exodus tradition. The name of Moses doesn't show up. You only finally have the name of Moses showing up in the post-exilic period, and only in a handful of the prophets here. So, for example, Zechariah is an important prophet. Nothing said of Moses. In the Aramaic half of the book of Daniel, nothing is said of Moses. Only the Hebrew portion, which is the last half or the later half of the book of Daniel, mentions Moses. The older half in Aramaic doesn't. So these are like things that are weird. It's like, hey, if Moses is the most important person in all of Jewish history, why does nobody talk about him until well after the exile?
So this is all fits in then with the, and I'm sure you're going to go on to talk about this, but perhaps this is a good time to mention that, as I said, one of the theories is that the Bible was, or the Hebrew Bible was written predominantly during this period of exile. So as there was this Babylonian exile where these peoples were in, or this people, they were in Babylonia. They would be scrabbling around trying to create stories to give them a sense of identity from their own kind of backdrop and their own collective memory, but then looking around their surrounding culture, Babylonia, to pick up segments and aspects of stories and integrating them into their own biblical narrative. And so one of these stories is of King Sargon of Akkad, who had his birth story that looks remarkably like Moses. So you've got this Mesopotamian story. You've got this king who was put in a river in a reed basket covered in pitch, and of course pitch was relevant for there, but pitch arguably didn't exist, although we talk about this at length in the book. But
yeah, there's a pitch battle in there.
Yeah, very good. Arguably might not have existed in Egypt at the time, and yet we've got this pitched basket of Moses being sent down the river. Here we have King Sargon of Akkad. We have basically the Moses birth story happened prior to what we understand is the writing of the Moses and Exodus story. That had existed possibly hundreds and hundreds of years before that in one form or another. And then if you're saying that, okay, the Bible wasn't written until the exilic period and beyond, then that makes sense of the stealing of the birth story of Sargon of Akkad and applying it to one of their own kind of mythic heroes that represents their own coming into being as a people.
Yeah. And I would say more and more the evidence suggesting perhaps the bulk of like the writing that we come to know of as the Pentateuch happens post-exilic and perhaps well past the exilic period, which is part of what my article will be justifying.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the olden days. Let's talk about these oldest sources about the Exodus, about Amos and Hosea. So again, these are prophets hanging out in the northern kingdom of Israel. And there's this interesting line from Amos who seemed to be suggesting the Israelites were not the only ones that God saved and provided their own exodus. And a few commenters will at least note this line, but I need to highlight it, where, as I have quoted here, it says, here's God coming and saying, did I not bring Israel up from Egypt and the Philistines up from Cathor and the Arameans from Ker? Wait, so God saved the Israelites, the Philistines, and the Arameans?
Right. So
it's so it's basically as I quote up there, everyone gets an exodus.
Yeah.
Except Judah, because Judah is not part of this list, and Judah doesn't seem to have an exodus tradition at the same time. It's also a bit interesting. Amos himself, according to the book of Amos, is originally from the south, and then he basically moves north to do his prophetic work. So if there was an exodus tradition down south, nobody told him, and he only learned about it going north. So it's a really weird thing. And this idea that the Philistines also were saved by God is quite the surprise, given like all the other stories of the Israelites fighting the Philistines in David and Goliath and all those sorts of stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is to say that there is evidence of an Exodus story, but it's applied far more widely, and yet lacking of any kind of detail. It's just this claim of, didn't I save you? Didn't I bring you from Egypt?
Yeah. Amos doesn't say too much. Hosea says more. But the interesting thing is that I'm mostly relying on the work of Thomas Dozeman, another scholar of the Hebrew Bible, and he highlights a few things that are quite interesting when you look at the details. When Hosea is talking about that God saved Israel from Egypt, brought them out of the desert, out of the wilderness, but he uses the words in such a way that are really weird, where ultimately when Hosea is talking about the wilderness or about the desert, he doesn't seem to be talking about a physical location. He's talking about desert as metaphor, as like desolation. So I brought you out of desolation rather than a particular location. So, for example, God says he knew Israel in the desert, but that doesn't fit the Exodus tradition or the biblical tradition generally. That's not where God first showed up and said hi to his chosen people. Also, the wording is a bit weird in places when, for example, in 2 verse 15, it says that Israel was supposed to have been led into the desert, but if you go to the Hebrew, the preposition is missing. So it's weird language where it's no longer being led into the desert, it's just led while in the desert, rather than to that place or from that place. In fact, the word that is being used here is a bit interesting. So if you go to later in the book of Jeremiah, if you look through most of the Pentateuch, the verb that is used for Israel being brought out of Egypt is yatzah, but both Amos and Hosea don't use that word. They instead use this different word, Allah, and this word has kind of a different valence where it can also mean like to sprout up, like sprout out of the ground or to go up a hill. And it seems to be suggesting not that they went from like one place to another place, but in place they were able to finally rise up and actually live in freedom again. They were no longer under the Egyptian boot. So the Exodus is not being brought out of Egypt, but out of Egyptian hegemony.
Right. Okay. And is that how you would understand Amos as well? Amos as well.
Yeah, because he's using the same language. And also, this would historically work well because the Philistines, we know that they were living along the coast at about the same time that a people group called Israel was existing, like roughly that same time they're there. And they're still under Egyptian hegemony, basically until about 1150 BC, more or less. And then at that time, then like the Egyptian empire completely collapses internally, and that's when Canaan is finally able to be independent again. The Arameans, it's something similar. It looks like that they were under the boot of other powers until this point. So it looks like what might have been happening is, hey, those outsiders are no longer running the place anymore. We're free. Thank God. We'll figure out which God later, but. That's what the tradition looks like. So it looks like the Exodus happened in place. So there wasn't actually a migration of people. It was a people in the land who no longer basically had the boots on their necks and could speak of freedom in that kind of way. That might be the earliest form of the Exodus.
In other words, those early accounts, I mean, if you were to go to the previous slide here, then those earlier accounts are actually not really giving an account of a geographical exodus, but a more of an abstract kind of hegemonic release, if you like.
Yeah. I guess if we were to put it into modern political stuff, it would be like the Ukrainians currently living in Crimea, and the hope that eventually they will be free again. They don't have to leave Crimea. The invaders will be gone.
Yeah, excellent. I see what you've done there. Thank you. So
if only there was some other if only there was some other YouTube channel that people could go to about daily updates about the war in Ukraine.
Now, funny you should say. So that interesting stuff.
Yeah. And so I'm piecing this together between a couple different scholars suggesting that this might be the earliest form of an Exodus tradition. It's a tradition within the land rather than to the land. But eventually that does change, because clearly that's the version we have in the Pentateuch. And we start seeing that change with Jeremiah. He's the first Judean to even mention the Exodus. And he's writing this pretty much at the tail end of the existence of Judah, right before the Babylonian exile and into the Babylonian exile. And he knows and he uses the work of Hosea. So he's literally quoting from Hosea. So that's ultimately his main source for this Exodus tradition. The Exodus tradition comes from Israel to Judah after Israel itself is destroyed by the Assyrian Empire coming in and crushing them. And those fleeing then came south, and that's when Judea started becoming a more prosperous nation. And then eventually the Babylonians come in and said, nice gold you got there. It's ours now. What, you're not going to freely give it to us? Well, now we're going to really come in and mess you up. And that leads to the exile. I'm oversimplifying a lot, but that's kind of the basics of what's happening there. Jeremiah is writing at that cusp. And if you look at Jeremiah, he knows the Exodus tradition and he's starting to adapt it. So for one is now it's starting to look like there's a move from Egypt to Palestine. Originally he'll use Hosea's language and he'll use the same verb, but eventually he'll switch over to this other verb that seems to be more indicative of being taken out of a place and having translocation. But
so if this is the cut, so Jeremiah's on the cusp of the exilic period. So like what I'm trying to think is functionally what's going on there. What is a function of his story? Is why would he want to adapt it in that way? Unless he's already got a sense that is the truth of the story.
Yeah. And well, in part because he's going to see, hey, already the North has been destroyed and that there are people there that are potentially in exile. So the exile tradition then, or the Exodus tradition comes down to the South and can develop and grow there. But interestingly, if you read Jeremiah, such as in this bit here, he seems to know of an idea of early Israel, of the early followers of Yahweh, completely following the laws and being dutiful to the Lord Almighty. So we have these statements here. What is it? Israel was holy to the Lord, his fruit to harvest, how he was a bride and loved me and followed me through the wilderness. So basically, Israel, totally good, followed all the prescripts and followed through the wilderness just fine. Have you read Exodus and Numbers? Golden calf have to be in the wilderness for 40 years as punishment for not following the laws. That isn't there. There is no plight of Israel in the desert.
Right. So, okay, the what you're saying then, just to kind of parse this out and make sure I am understanding what you're saying and the viewer is understanding what you're saying. So, you've got this lack of knowledge of a pre-existing idea that of the Exodus story as we come to know it now.
Mm-hmm.
So either he didn't know about it or he's ignoring it. So it's unlikely that story of say the golden calf, a part of the Exodus, the book of Exodus, it's more likely that was written after Jeremiah. Which,
yes,
considering Jeremiah was on the cusp of the exile, then we have good reason to believe that the Exodus account was post Jeremiah, because he has no knowledge of elements of the story, and in fact, none of the prophets hitherto have any knowledge of the story as set out in Exodus, which supposedly predates all of these prophets.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, we're seeing things that are missing, but we are also seeing development. Yeah. And this even happens more so once we get to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel is writing during the exile. He's living in Babylonia. His first visions, he even says he's like walking along the river, and then all of a sudden the sky opened up, and basically all the glory of heaven basically appeared to him, and he's dumbfounded, to put it mildly. And if we're going through and we're looking at all of his prophetic stuff, Ezekiel definitely knows of the Exodus tradition, and we're seeing additional changes to it. In particular, Ezekiel now says, oh yeah, Israel totally screwed up in the wilderness. They did not follow the commandments of God, and that's ultimately the reason why the Judean people are living in exile now, because of what the ancestors did. The ancestors failed to follow the laws of God, and so God is like, fine, you do this crap for a while, and then I'm going to really punish you later. And Ezekiel's point is, if we finally follow the mandates that Yahweh provides, then exile can end, and we can actually atone for the sins of our past and return to glory and in strong relationship with God again.
Isn't this indicative of some other thinking that was going on? Is it Josiah and sorry, I'm so long out this, I need to brush up. But the idea that some of these moral proclamations are a way of they're explicable by understanding that, you know, people have done wrong, and therefore these rules were put in place, and there's a lot of recourse to like immoral behavior and sort of correction thereof, and this kind of fits in with this idea that actually etiologically, so explaining how things come to how things are by putting a story behind it, you know, etiologically, the understanding that actually, you know, as you say, this was we did wrong, hence, you know, why we ended up in this place, and why we're in exile now. So it's kind of an etiological underpinning of the exile itself.
Yeah. Basically, it says, hey, things are going bad. How did we screw up? And explain what's going on here without basically throwing out Yahweh with the baby bathwater, assuming we're washing with God. I'm mixing metaphors terribly. I apologize.
No problem. But yeah, no, interesting. Sorry if I was like, words are difficult. But yeah, interesting stuff. Again, it's all piecing together. And what I'm also realizing, Aaron, is that there are so many more chapters to add to our list of chapters that we've got.
Oh, don't worry. This is in there. This is currently in our book.
Yeah, good. Which shows you I need to get back to actually checking out the manuscript. It's been a long time since I've done that. You've been busily working away while I've been
Yeah.
banging on other subjects. But yeah,
All
carry on.
right. All right, so I'll try to go a bit more quickly. So later in the latter additions to Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, this is written at the tail end of the exile, and we know that because he refers to the Persian king Cyrus and calls him the Messiah because of all the good stuff he did in kicking the butts of those bad Babylonians. And in Deutero-Isaiah, we have God defeating Egypt in two different ways. Oh, yes. Lex Lata. You are right that, yeah, I'm very much influenced by both Gad and Yonatan's work in showing that when it comes to the archaeology, what we can actually find in the ground, a traditional form of Judaism existing before even the Hellenistic period is hard to find. There's Yahweh worship, but definitely not monotheism, and not even the Torah observance until well after the time it's supposed to have been. But let me just also note here, in Deutero-Isaiah, we also get the first time in the prophets something that looks like the parting of the Red Sea. This is the first time that story seems to show up. And it's also a bit of a mixed tradition there, because one part of Isaiah talks about Egypt being defeated by a giant wind coming in to split the waters. And another part, the sea is defeated with weapons because the sea is actually a mother ducking dragon.
Yeah. And is that part to do with the kind of assimilation of Baal, like mythology? You've got this statement that Yahweh is defeating like sea monsters, like, you know, but it's like the one up from Baal, like all of your myths, you know, we can do one better, and so on and so forth. So that there's possibly an element of that.
Well, the imagery of the storm god, that comes from Baal and early contest between Baal practice and Yahweh practitioners. Also, the defeating of a sea monster to create the universe. You find that in the Babylonian myths with Marduk, for example. Yeah, so that's the sort of tradition this is coming from, which also says something interesting. The tradition of creation by combat is older than the parting of the Red Sea story, but then that sort of language of the creation of the universe is now being used to describe the Exodus. So we're actually seeing the adaptation of creation myth to now have creation of a nation myth.
Interesting.
So, like I say, we're following the developments by going through all of this. And hey, I haven't even mentioned the actual Pentateuch yet, because it's not clear it existed yet for the prophets. Sources for it, perhaps, but definitely not the 5 books of Moses all put together yet.
So just a question from my mate Rob. So back to my earlier question, I haven't showed you his earlier questions. Could Israel have been drawing on myths from earlier East while in Babylon? And his earlier questions were Saraswati is Brahman's consort in Hinduism, and I wonder if this has informed the Abraham and wife Sarah story. And on an earlier attack, even there's some interesting speculation that Brahman and Saraswati and Hindu pairing are related to Abraham and Sarai. Have you heard of this?
Okay, so definitely nothing that far east from India have I heard or seen evidence for, particularly. On the other hand, if that were to come along, it would probably come through the intermediary of the Persian Empire, which neighbored and even like poked into Indian territory. And a lot of Persian religion is drawn from and derived from older Hindu mythology. So like Mithra, actually, that god is, I think, originally a sun god from India, and then Zoroastrianism is kind of an offshoot of those sorts of earlier Brahma religions, which then becomes like the major religion for the Persians, who then are controlling of the territories that the Jewish people are living in. And so, yeah, that could be a vector of that kind of influence.
So actually, Rob might be onto something in some way that actually there is
Yeah.
some strangled pathway for those ideas to come through the exilic period geographically through Babylonia, because they are obviously further to the east and therefore
Mhm.
geographically closer to those older Hindu myths. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks,
And
Rob.
probably actually, if anything, it would be post-exilic, because that's when the Persians would then be dominating there. So, and the Persians are even further east than the Babylonians.
Interesting.
So if that vector is true, then yeah, it would probably be post-exilic, but I would have to see what the actual evidence is, and it would only probably be indirect because no actual Hindi scripture is transferred there, as far as I know. All right, so let's talk about our favorite book, or books for that matter. All right, we already talked a bit about the problems with the idea of Moses writing the Pentateuch. So just to highlight again, the whole book is written in third person. Moses never said, I said this or I did this. He's talking as if he's on the wrong side of the Jordan River when he never was supposed to enter the Holy Land. He says he's the most humble person that ever lived, which is exactly what a humble person would say. He talks about his own death happening way in the past. It's the sort of stuff that is just not even
so it's
feasible.
not just about writing about his death, obviously, but way in the past. But then there are so many reasons why he couldn't have written it, and then of course it's the multiple source theory as well, which is indisputable. But yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So like I say, except for those who are fundamentally bent, critical scholars agree Moses didn't write this, and there is a multiplicity of sources, though the exact form of those sources and how they all relate together is still actively debated, and I will not pretend to have solved the debate, not even by a million miles. But the basic idea is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, traditionally there's something called the documentary hypothesis that sees 4 primary sources that were then integrated together to create the Pentateuch. There's a lot of editing along the way, and when these sources were written is extremely hard to pin down. When Julius Wellhausen first articulated this back in the 19th century, he had J and E as extremely ancient, like going back to like the early days of the monarchy to like David and Solomon times, and then P being exilic or even maybe slightly post-exilic. Nowadays, many people entertain the idea that all of these sources were at least touched up, if not composed, in the post-exilic period. Now, and also, these various sources also have earlier chunks. So like Deuteronomy, there's a chunk of it, I think it's from chapters 12 through 24. I can't remember exactly right now which chapters it is, but that chunk is considered the oldest part of Deuteronomy. So even the sources have internal sections and earlier fractions. And as you can imagine, it's all hella complicated.
Yeah, and I remember, like, I loved writing this chapter, and goodness me, I'm going to have to go back and edit it and look at it now. But I love writing the chapter on source, documentary hypothesis, and looking at sources. So rich with interesting ideas. It's like, as Lex Lata says, there are copious anachronisms. So actually, we're going to relate this to the Exodus story. The idea that there are camels mentioned in the Exodus story, or prior to the Exodus story, with the is it the Midianites with the camels? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Anyways.
You have multiple camels. That you have camels in the Abraham story, in the Joseph cycle, in the Exodus itself, because they also got hit by the plagues in Egypt.
Yeah.
In fact, I actually found out the camel acronym is even worse than I thought, because
really.
Because here's the thing: the Egyptians did not.
Just to explain that the idea is that the story has camels in it, but camels didn't exist in Egypt in domesticated form at that time. Anyway, sorry, Karen.
Yeah. So yeah, like camels are not domesticated and running around the Holy Land until like the 10th or 9th century, which is way after the time of the Exodus and like 1,000 years after like the time of Abraham, roughly. But it's even worse than that, because apparently camels did not start to become significantly used in Egypt until maybe the Ptolemaic period. So we're talking like the 300s BC.
Wow.
So it's an acronym by over 1,000 years.
Yeah, and not only that, Lex, but also the documentary hypothesis is certainly true in some form or other, with a whole bunch of different things. So just off the top of my head, redundancy is an interesting one, where you have repetition of certain elements of a story or stories as a whole that are pointless. That, like, you wouldn't have redundancy if you're trying to create some like whole joined up narrative, and the only reason you'd have this repetition is if you're taking multiple sources and multiple accounts of those stories and smashing them together, either into the same story or having different elements of that story from different sources in different places. And so redundancy is a really interesting one. You see that a lot in the, say, the flood myth, and you have like one kind of element of redundancy. It would be, was it 40 days or 150 days? So one part, the Genesis account is like raining for 40 days, 40 nights and blah blah blah, and another part is 150 days, and you're like, okay, which one is it? So there are overt contradictions as well as redundancies, where you have exactly the same thing said and you're like, well, there's no need to say that twice, and it's only said twice because of multiple sources. Anyway, also linguistic analysis. So Lex, again, first millennium Hebrew linguistically is well later than the time associated with Moses. So there's also linguistic analysis, and that's the same with Book of Daniel and all sorts, where you're like, okay, it's claimed to be written at this point, but it's impossible that it's written at that point, because actually linguistically they wouldn't have said this in that particular way and use that kind of language, etc., etc.
Yeah, and just to make clear what that is for everyone, basically that it would be like saying, I found this book written in French during the days of Julius Caesar. It's like, French didn't exist yet. It's an offshoot of Latin, in the same way Hebrew is an offshoot of earlier Canaanite or other Semitic languages, and its emergence is somewhere around like the 10th century BCE. And when I say its emergence, like we find a little ostraca where like there's like a bit of a calendar on it, things like that. Like our earliest fragments of what looks to be Hebrew is that. Definitely not whole books, definitely not a full-fledged separate language, and definitely not what you'd expect if Moses wrote this all in Hebrew. Also, it's worth noting, you probably also can't take the entire Hebrew Bible and think, oh, maybe it's actually all translated from Egyptian. That doesn't seem to follow either.
Yeah, and there's also, you got to watch out for certain claims. So recently, and I say recently, about, was it 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, they thought they found this early Hebrew writing archaeologically, and they were sort of all shouting about this in all the journals, and, or not quite the journals, but actually like Christianity Today and et cetera, but actually it was found not to be the case, and so on and so forth. So
if you're talking about the lead curse tablet from Scott Stripling,
yes.
Okay, all you have to do is note that this is not possible is you look at their own reading of the script that they think they're seeing, and you look at the line that they draw for how you read it, and it's wrapping around like it's a drunk ant going in a circle and bouncing around to connect all these letters together. And you realize no one has ever written that way. No one ever would write that way. This is exactly what you expect from pareidolia and a whole host of cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning. That is, unfortunately, the entirety of the evidence. Yes, curse.
Yeah. So, anyway, back to the documentary hypothesis.
Okay. So, all right. So what are the exact relationships between these sources? What are these sources actually? It's still highly debatable, but let me just show where the sources come into play in their relationships when it comes to the plague tradition. And I'm mostly relying here on the works of John Van Setters, a rather esteemed Hebrew Bible scholar. Mm-hmm. And here are the things that are a bit interesting. So the plague tradition doesn't seem to exist in the exilic or pre-exilic authors. Like Ezekiel has all sorts of terrible things to say to Egypt, but never brings up that one time that God came in and killed all their firstborns or anything like that. That whole story is missing. The language of the plague, of the signs and wonders, if you go to the Hebrew for that, you find that language used, for example, in Isaiah, but he doesn't use it for the plagues of Egypt. He talks about his own naked body as signs and wonders for the people. So either he thought he had an amazing looking body, or he doesn't associate this to any sort of Exodus and plague tradition. So it's in some ways apparently not that ancient, and there are a mix of traditions going on. So if you go to Exodus 7 through 11, those chapters, you get a whole on the 10 famous plagues, but there are signs there that there's a mixing of traditions. There is, as you mentioned, like some duplications of things being said about like what parts of the water are and are not being turned to blood. Is the Nile being turned to blood, or is it all the water? Is it the pools of water around the Nile that you can drink or you can't drink? It's kind of confusing. There's sometimes Aaron is mentioned as the one who is actually enacting the curse, and sometimes the wording formulas are different. And if you separate out the two sets of lists, like here's like this word formula, here's where Aaron is doing the curse, you get these separate lists, and we can tell that they should be separate because you take one of those lists and it's exactly the tradition that you find in Psalm 78. So the J version of the plagues seems to existing on its own in Psalm 78. And the other set of plague traditions goes to the priestly source, and these are supposed to actually been a competition of magic spells or magic tricks between Aaron and the Egyptian priests or the Egyptian sorcerers.
Yeah, and interestingly, Mitch Mazerol, legend that he is, says, doesn't the Bible also implicitly concede that the Egyptians had command of magical powers, snake from a stick and all that?
Exactly.
I've long used that as an argument that actually the Bible admits the occult. Essentially, the Bible admits that non-Jewish people can do magic.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
Oh yeah, well there's all sorts of things that show things that we would normally call occult. Like when King Saul goes to the quote-unquote witch of Endor, and basically that quote-unquote witch performs necromancy to talk to the dead prophet Samuel while he's in the in Sheol, and basically to pop back up as a dead ghost to basically say, now you're in so much trouble, Saul.
I mean, nothing like a good story, right?
Exactly. And if people are wondering where the Witch of Endor was, well, it's a forest moon. It's in a galaxy far, far away.
I was going to make an Ewok joke, but you beat me to it. So damn you.
Yeah. Okay. So it looks like in both the J and P sources, there are these two different plague traditions. One of them is basically a competition of magicians. So Aaron versus the Egyptian sorcerers. There's another one where it's God coming in and doing the plagues. And the interesting thing is in Psalm 78, it's God who's performing the plagues. Moses isn't even mentioned. Aaron isn't even mentioned. But if we go back to Deuteronomy, there's also a plague tradition there, but it's a plague on the Israelites while in Egypt. So Deuteronomy does not know the plagues against Egypt. They know plagues in Egypt against the Israelites.
Interesting. Yeah.
And Van Setters argues what's going on here is that basically the earlier tradition was the Israelites suffering plagues while in Egypt, basically for not doing what they're told. And the J source is seeing this and then adapting it and basically saying the difference is in the J source, it's the Egyptians who suffer and the Jews or the Israelites who don't, because they are with God, especially when it comes to like the killing of all the firstborns because of the blood over the door frames, the lamb's blood over there to protect them, and the Passover tradition from there. So, and then P comes along and it knows J and it's also responding to that. So what Van Setters argues is that first there's the D version of plagues. J sees that and adapts that, and P comes along and adapts that, and then finally an editor comes along and puts them all together in our book. And none of this is any older than the end of the Exile or post-exilic period. That's as far back as this tradition goes.
So in other words, we're talking maybe, depending on where you date the original conservative estimates, but maybe something like 1,000 years after it's supposed to have been written, there or thereabouts.
Yeah, 1,000 years after, and a developing tradition with these sources all speaking to and adjusting each other. Basically, Deuteronomy tells a story, J comes along and says, hold my wine. P comes along and says, I'm actually liking beer. Now hold that while I rewrite the story. And then an editor comes along, completely sloshed, and tries to put all of them together.
Nice. Well said.
All right, so I'm not going to go through all the different things here because, like I say, how all these sources interact with each other and the history of all those sources, hyper complicated. There's no consensus there. There's a consensus that there are sources, but exactly how to break them all apart is a good reason
Yeah.
to be a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and go to the panels and see people fight.
Yeah. So, for example, one theory is that J and E are not separable,
Mhm.
that they're the same source, and it's just JDP.
Yeah.
But so on and so forth. What we can certainly say with absolutely no doubt, there are multiple sources to the
Yeah.
Pentateuch.
At the very least, it was not one person. This is definitely written by committee.
Yeah.
And speaking of committee, let's talk about the committee that said, okay, we're willing to publish you, Mr. Adair.
Yay!
So finally, let's talk about Moses, because Moses, like I mentioned, is not mentioned in any any exilic prophets, only shows up in a handful of post-exilic prophets, and then is supposed to become the greatest hero of all time. How the hell of it did that happen? And there's been these oddities that have been known about, especially the name of Moses, the various outside the Bible traditions of Moses, and so I have now successfully gotten this book, or this article I wrote, through peer review at the Scandinavian Journal of the Old Testament. I had had this go through review at a few other journals. I had gotten some useful feedback, significantly rewrote things, submitted it to this journal, and they finally said, yep, you got something good here, and it's going to probably be printed probably next year. We'll see exactly when, once I could tell you that. But this journal is, pretty well regarded, but it's also like the hotspot for quote unquote biblical minimalism. So this is where all the cool kids hang out.
Yeah, so just to explain, in case anyone doesn't know, biblical minimalism is the idea that the Bible is minimally true, and archaeology generally won't support it. So originally what happened is that seminaries would pay for archaeologists to go and dig up in the Holy Land and elsewhere, and in digging up these sites, they would use the Bible as the benchmark for when things happened, and then take the data from their archaeological digs and fit that to the Bible. And that was kind of the done thing, because actually it was all being paid for by people who wanted to confirm the Bible by doing archaeology. Right? And then this was seen eventually as being a bit problematic, because things didn't quite fit, and eventually evidence won through, and people had to kind of readjust. And now we're in this position. So that's maximalism, which is the Bible is maximally true, and it is proven by archaeology. And you have people like Kenneth Kitchen and so on and so forth, who are these maximalists. And then you had this movement towards minimalism, people like Philip Davis, who would be like, okay, we're gonna throw out the Bible as being true, and would do archaeology and then see if we can find evidence of the Bible in the archaeology that we do. So we are not assuming the truth of the Bible. We are just starting with a blank slate and seeing where it takes us. And so you have these two different approaches. And what you're saying is that the journal that you've submitted that article to, that paper to, is on the minimalist side of things, which is
Yeah. All right. So a big part of what I'm doing is I'm looking at these other sources that talk about Moses that are not in the Bible, and also seem to be completely separate from the biblical tradition, in that they don't even seem to know about the Exodus story of the Pentateuch. They don't seem to know about Moses, the Jew, leading the Israelites out of Egypt. That is not what's actually in these other narratives. And the main sources that seem to talk about this sort of character, there's a person by the name of Hecataeus of Abdera. He's writing somewhere in the 310, 315 BCE times. So this is just shortly after the time of Alexander the Great. Egypt is now under Greek or Macedonian control, and he's going in and he's trying to learn more and more about what these Egyptians say about things. And he says, according to the Egyptians, there's this dude named Moses. He was a cool Egyptian guy, totally honorable and wise, and he led a big chunk of Egyptian colonists into the Levant to set up a new colony there, and set up the city of Jerusalem and its religious center, and expand the territory through combat and things like that. And you look at this and say, whoever wrote this, one, didn't have anything bad to say about Moses, and two, doesn't know anything about the Exodus tradition, because this Moses doesn't decimate Egypt, enters the Holy Land, even though the biblical Moses wasn't supposed to have done that, sets up a religious system in Jerusalem. Jerusalem isn't even mentioned in the Pentateuch. That's a little issue there. Definitely doesn't set up the temple. The temple priesthood is supposed to be totally meritocratic rather than everyone needs to be the descendant of my big brother. That's how it works with Moses and his brother Aaron, my namesake.
Yep.
And yeah, it's just, and according to Hecataeus, he's getting this from the Egyptians themselves. This is what the Egyptians are saying, who this Moses is. There's a later writer by the name of Manetho who actually is an Egyptian himself and writes in Greek, basically a history of Egypt that we have fragments of, especially quoted in the Jewish historian Josephus. Also talks about Moses as this Egyptian priest who leads a rebellion and eventually has to flee to Palestine, but he's not a Jew himself. Weirdly enough, he only changed his name to Moses later on. There's this other figure by the name of Atrophanes, who is himself a Jew, but he seems to be mixing stories together because he knows the Bible story. He definitely is quoting from and using the book of Exodus, but he's got all these other traditions that aren't in there. For example, Moses leads a military invasion of Ethiopia. You don't find that in your Bible. But there was this folk hero that the Egyptians had called Sesostris. He is first mentioned by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, another Greek historian, and he becomes this folk hero in Egyptian times during the Hellenistic period, during the times when the Greeks are controlling Egypt. So it's like, hey, it seems like somebody has taken this Moses figure and has basically made him into an Egyptian folk hero. How does that possibly fit with the idea that Moses was this person who came in, devastated Egypt with all these plagues, and took thousands, if not millions of people out of Egypt forcefully?
So these are all pre-existing or contemporaneous accounts of somebody called Moses that
Yes.
may or may not have connections to this story as we eventually see it in the Hebrew Bible. Do any of these three accounts have connection to each other? Are they?
So it's hard to tell, especially because we have so much of it in extremely fragmented forms. The stuff we have from Atrophanes, he is only quoted by Eusebius in the 4th century CE. Manetho, we only have a handful of quotes, mostly from Josephus, and he's only quoting the parts he cares about. That
So
looks kind of
none
sort
of
of like an
these-
Exodus.
So those two you just mentioned, we don't have extant evidence of the original sources where any quoting. It's a bit like Celsus, where we don't know of him from the original source, only from the
Yeah.
quoting of him and the counter arguments to him. So
Yeah.
that's the same thing.
Yeah, well, I'll say this. For Hecataeus, what we have from him about this is paraphrased. Manetho, Josephus says he's actually quoting him exactly. He's quoting him carefully. And this is actually important for my article, that he quotes Manetho exactly how he spells certain words. I use that as part of my case. And Atrophanes, we only have much later in Eusebius, and I forget if he's quoting or paraphrasing.
All right. Interesting.
So it's very indirect, but nonetheless, you look at these stories and they're like, this ain't the Bible that I grew up with. How did these stories come about? And why does it look so Egyptian in flavor and Egyptian in positivity? And in particular, the name Moses itself is widely considered to actually be problematic as a Hebrew name. So the story is that when Moses is a baby, he is saved by having his mother put him in a reed basket to float down the Nile. Then basket is then discovered by the daughter of Pharaoh, who sees the child and rescues her from the river. And because she draws out the child from the river, gives the baby the name Moses. It comes from the Hebrew verb masha, and the active participial form of that is Moshe, and that is the name of Moses in Hebrew, Moshe.
But the problem being, as I'm sure you're going to say, is that is the active voice and not the passive voice. So
Yes.
he's called the drawing out of rather than the being drawn out of.
Right. That is one problem. There's also the issue, why is an Egyptian princess giving a baby a Hebrew name?
Right.
Third, this is clearly mythological because this is the same story told of like Sargon of Akkad, that he was also in a reed basket and saved from the river. This is the same sort of story of Romulus and Remus, who were saved floating down the river. You even find this in Chinese legends in Journey to the West. Tung Sung is a monk who also, as a baby, is put on a raft and sent down the river and saved. So this is a mythical trope. In other words, it's probably not how he got his name because it's not real.
Yeah.
And also, there's something weird that I also point out in my article, is that the Greek spelling of the name, you can't actually derive from the Hebrew. That this is not the normal way that you would actually derive this name. It has features that show it's really irregular. It's got like the wrong sorts of vowels. It has this weird diphthong in the Greek. It has vowels that you wouldn't expect. The declension, basically, in English, we don't have declension so much, but like the difference between he and him, the ways that we adjust words for what it's doing in the sentence. Greek has a complicated version of that, and Moses has an irregular declension. So it's like somebody knows that I need to change this from the subject to the predicate in this sentence, but I'm not going to follow the normal ways to do that. Why? Why does it have all these weird features if it's just being directly translated from Hebrew?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that the Bible, as we've come to receive it, is written in Greek, which you got a whole problem of 72 people, stuck in a room and magically coming up with the same book, the Septuagint, so on and so forth. But anyway, we've got the Greek Bible, if you like, or the Bible in Greek, and it is impossible to get Moses as written in Greek from an Egyptian
from the Hebrew
word. From the Hebrew.
Yeah, I shouldn't say impossible, but it's highly unexpected.
Yes.
You look at like the same vowel pointing like I have here. This is from the Masoretic text, the way that it indicates how the vowels are supposed to be pronounced. And you look at other examples of the same sorts of things throughout the Masoretic text and how it gets put into the Septuagint, and it doesn't really match those norms. So why is it so irregular, both in the vowels and in the way that the noun is declined? Why is it so darn weird? It's almost like it's being translated from a non-Hebrew source.
And here we go.
And I think I found the source, because in Egyptian, there is a word that means to go as a verb or journey as a noun, and it is pronounced in Coptic Moshe. Does that sound like Moshe?
It does.
Yeah, it sure does. And this word is pretty important if you're going to talk about a person who, I don't know, travels to some new place, that goes on some sort of journey, maybe leads a group of people. Also, this word is also used for someone, or for like laws, both human and cosmic. The cluster of consonants is also the same cluster of consonants that is used for another word in Coptic, meshe, which is for army. So the word also has a militaristic coloring to it. So person who leads an army and institutes laws. I think I've heard of a story like this. And this matches the sorts of Egyptian stories you have of the Moses figure going and becoming a colonist into Palestine, leading military expeditions into Ethiopia. And more importantly, go ahead.
No, carry on.
Okay. And also importantly, if Moshe, the Egyptian word, is the source, it explains things, because this weird spelling of Moses in Greek with an omega and upsilon, this is actually a common Egyptian spelling of words when put into Greek. This is not a regular thing that Greeks do. This is not regular diphthong for Greeks in both Attic and Koine, the sorts of a Greek that people would have known and used at that time. But it was common for the Egyptians to write words this way. So Manetho is writing in Greek the name Moses like this, with this weird extra vowel. And it's also the exact same spelling in the Greek Old Testament.
So what you're saying here, is this pretty original scholarship that you've done on this?
Yes.
So we are, this is brilliant. And this is the subject of your paper to be published.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
And I need to now show you the smoking gun.
right, okay, do it.
So this can seem to explain the weird spelling in the Septuagint, but what we have quoted from Manetho gives us a clue, because, as I mentioned, according to Manetho, originally that Moses character had a different name. Originally, he was an Egyptian priest known as Osarseth. And then it just says, and he changed his name to Moses. Well, why the halibut did he do that? And all we are given is this statement in Greek. It translates as, because he went over to those people. He went over. And the Greek term there, metabino or bino, this will get translated into Coptic as Moshe. In other words, he changed his name because he went over. He was the goer. And what's the Egyptian word for the person who goes? Moshe.
Right. So it all makes sense.
Yes. It also makes sense because one other little detail, I mentioned that the declension of Moses in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, is weird. It's irregular. It happens to also be the same irregular declension that Manetho uses for other Egyptian names, including other pharaohs, including Osarseth. So the Septuagint is matching the spelling and the irregular declension that Manetho uses. So if Manetho is not the source, he's close to it.
So a question here from on Biduel Day. I remember him telling me what that means. I can't remember now. Did he change his name, or was it an appellation given to him?
I would have to go back to the Greek and check. I do not remember off the top of my head.
Right.
I think it uses active form, but like I said, I really can't be sure unless I go and check the Greek directly.
Yeah.
So, like I say, this is what I think is kind of the last bit of smoking gun. And lastly, Moshe in Egyptian, specifically in Demotic, I believe you can derive the name of Moses in Hebrew. It sounds already pretty darn similar. There's only one issue, that the Egyptian word has an extra consonant that isn't in Moses in Hebrew. It's this letter called ayin. And I have to argue why that's the case. The ayin is actually a pretty weak vowel. In fact, if you read like a Hebrew textbook, if you're learning biblical Hebrew, it'll even say that the Hebrew ayin has no sound, which isn't quite correct, but it's an extremely weak and subtle sound, and it's even weaker in Egyptian. So much so that some sources say it was just a vowel, or at least in some cases it was a vowel. Technically, the literature on it will call it a voiced pharyngeal fricative.
Yeah.
So it's pronounced something like an
like there's a voiced fricative there's a place name in Ukraine that I always get in trouble with because I try and pronounce it too much, but it is Vuhladar, and it's kind of but anyway.
And it's also the case that the ayin in Egyptian at this time was already quite weak. In fact, it was in the process in this word of being devoiced. So it's already hard to hear in the first place for an English speaker. And it's even getting weaker at this time. So it would have been understandable if it was dropped. And I found some other precedent for Egyptian words coming into Hebrew that kind of lose the ayin along the way. Most importantly, it already sounds really close to the word Moshe in Hebrew. It already sounds pretty darn close. And this really rare verb is only used in one other place in the Old Testament. Technically two places, but it's actually a copy-paste. And it's David singing about how he is being saved by Yahweh, that Yahweh has come in and drawn him out of watery chaos to save him from destruction. So my hypothesis is this song of David was already known, and this is the only other example of the verb masha being used in the Hebrew scriptures at the time. The figure of Moshe comes along, and where's the only other place that this verb is used? Where someone is drawn out of water to save them. And this might explain how Moses gets his name, from a combination of this outside name coming in and being incorporated into this only use case in Hebrew.
Interesting. Brilliant. So that gives some indication of how his name came to be. What does that say about the historicity of him? Does it say anything about the likelihood then that Moses existed as a person?
Oh, this would basically put the probability exceedingly close to zero, because this would suggest that originally Moses was an Egyptian folk hero created, I estimate, sometime between the time of Alexander the Great and the writing of Hecataeus of Abdera. In this 20-year window is when Moses first develops as an Egyptian folk hero.
Right, and then that gets taken. So how? Give us the synopsis then of how this folk hero. Then talk us through how it happened that this folk hero. Who wrote about this folk hero, and how did it get to be in the Bible? To give us that final sort of conclusion.
All right, so it looks like that this is, like I say, a folk hero, and either whether he's, I use folk hero a little bit loosely just because we can't be sure if this is a story told by scholars or elite people in Egypt, or the common folk, or both. We can't really tell, because the only sources we have are literate people, because only literate people write things down. So it's hard to know for sure. So I'm using folklore a little bit broadly, but nonetheless, Egyptians are talking about this figure. It is being noticed by Greek sources like Hecataeus of Abdera in about 315 BCE, roughly. And Jews are living in Egypt at this time. Alexandria became a major hub of Jewish activity, and it's also the place most likely that the Septuagint was translated, or at least that's where traditionally it's placed. We, of course, know that Jews had been living, or Israelites had been living in Egypt for centuries at this point, as we had mentioned with like the Elephantine documents and Ostraca papyri, those sorts of things there, showing that, yeah, such people had been living there for a long time, in contact with, for better or for worse, with the local populace. And the stories of this Moses figure is actually used by the Egyptians to explain Jewish customs. So the earliest version we have of Moses, talked about by Hecataeus of Abdera, Moses takes a bunch of Egyptian colonists from Egypt to Palestine, to the Holy Land, to create a colony there, and that explains why the Jews there are circumcised, because that's an Egyptian tradition that they carried on.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was going to talk about like some theories about circumcision. I know that Hector Avalos had a theory that it indicated slavery, perhaps that could have been why it was like a mark of slavery, and there could have been some connections with circumcision through that way. But you're actually saying something different, that it existed in Egypt prior to.
Well, yeah, we know the Egyptians practiced circumcision. And apparently the Egyptians themselves are trying to explain other people's cultures, but of course saying, well, ours is the dominant culture and we're responsible for all these other groups. So Hecataeus talks about how the Greeks are originally Egyptians, how the Babylonians are originally Egyptians. Have you ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
I don't think I've seen it, but I've almost seen it a few times, but yeah.
Okay, there's the father figure there who basically tell him a word and he'll figure out some Greek etymology, because all language comes from there. And so someone even gives him like the word komodo, and tries to come up with an etymology for the Japanese word komodo from Greek. This feels like what the Egyptians are doing. Everything is actually Greek if you think about it enough. We're just that important. And I argue what the political and cultural circumstances for why the Egyptians were doing that, specifically in the late 4th century, because this is after the Egyptians are conquered by the Persians, and then conquered by Alexander the Great, and then under Macedonian control until the Romans finally decide that they'll run the place. So the Egyptians are like, I thought we were awesome. We built the freaking pyramids, and yet we don't even control our own country. So to fight that cognitive dissonance, to say, but we're actually culturally superior.
Yeah.
The Moses figure evolves from that.
So that the Moses figure evolves from that in Egyptian folklore, and then it's exported via what? Via Greeks writing about this. How does that then get to?
Yeah, that is a little bit hard to tell. There's probably a combination of things. So part of it is probably direct connections, because again, Jews are living in Egypt. Jews are talking to Egyptians. They also can talk to each other in Aramaic, that had been the common lingua franca for a long time. Maybe Greek later, but Aramaic is probably the source, again, because there's a good match between the Egyptian word Moshe and then Moshe in Hebrew. And you're not going to get that if Greek is the intermediary, because the sh sound doesn't exist in Greek. So it looks like to get that to travel, you need to be linguistically closer. So it must be someone who uses that sh sound normally to write that down. And you wouldn't have done that if they were using Greek writing as their source. Yeah. So they're probably hearing this from actual Egyptians.
And so you've got Jewish people hearing the name and hearing the story, and then taking on their own stories and adapting, and there's a kind of assimilation of these ideas, and out of which emerges the story of Moses that takes on aspects of Sargon of Akkad, that takes on aspects of the Egyptian story, and then possibly wants to create something that's heroic for their own culture, that gives them a sense of beginning to their own recent history, I guess, and then sees this person as heroic, so adds in all of those kind of heroic tropes, and then has elements, and this doesn't all happen at once, though, of course, as you said previously, and then takes on elements of like Yahweh being better than Baal, so you've got elements of that coming in, and eventually you have this story that kind of functionally does all of those things in a nice kind of neat package. So it's, well, I say a nice, neat package, elements taken from all over the place and then sort of smashed together. But is that generally how you would then see it?
Yeah. I see it as that. Yeah, it's a. I'm careful to use the word appropriate just because that will have some other connotations, but nonetheless, seeing this tradition and then adopting it to themselves and making a superior version for themselves, and at a time when Jewish and Egyptian relations may not have been all that positive.
Yeah, and it looks like you're going to have a fight on your hands, because Lex later says Moses was an Egyptian administrator or soldier stationed in Canaan who went native and became a leader among proto-Israelites during the Bronze Age collapse. Fight me.
From a distance, okay.
All I can say is you're going to have to read our book when it comes out in about 34 years' time. So
I guess now his question is, what will get out first, my article or our book? I don't know.
But yeah, so that's really fascinating, mate. And there's, oh my goodness me, I mean, we have only touched the surface on so many of these different elements of the story. I mean, goodness, you can spend 2 hours talking about whether it's the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. We haven't even talked about that. You can talk about the plagues and about the emergence of those as ideas, and about how they are completely philosophically bizarre and incoherent. We can talk about all sorts of elements of this story, like every component of the whole Exodus story is problematic from start to finish. There is no element of that is not like utterly bizarre. Like even when you've got like parts of the story that make no philosophical sense. So you've got the Pharaoh saying no to the request of let my people go, and he's having his heart hardened, which is therefore God changing his mind, or either not sure whether he's going to say X or Y, so makes sure that he definitely says X, and then punishes them on the account of that happening. It's like, well, God made that, hey, you harden his heart. So the philosophical issue of that. Then you've got like the Moses story about God changing his mind when Moses touches his circumcised son, anyway,
the son's circumcised penis touching his foot somehow alleviates the anger of Yahweh that happened for who knows what reason.
Yeah, it's either his foot or his forehead. Like, I think there's some linguistic issues as to which it is, but either way, God goes, oh, like, great thing you've done there. Well done for touching your forehead with your circumcised son's penis. I'm now going to change my mind. Which shows God is completely fallible and really rather bizarre. So it's like so you've got the idea is you've got historical, archaeological, linguistic, cultural, anthropological, philosophical, theological issues with the Exodus story from the very start to the very finish. It makes no sense in any of those domains, and it's just thoroughly problematic. And that's what we're hoping to do in the book, is to touch on elements of these. But as I'm sure the viewer can imagine, like each one of these areas just goes on, it's this potentially ballooning issue where, oh my goodness, we have to establish that, and oh my goodness, that's a problem. Like camels and pitch, like I spent a whole chapter talking about pitch in there, and it's like, that's freaking irrelevant, but it's just another element of the issues.
It's probably a good thing I didn't spend as much time talking about the existence of Yahweh as we did about pitch, because, oh my goodness, our book will be 10,000 pages.
Yeah, so I'm sure there's going to be some heavy editing. But so anything that you want to add, or any questions from the audience, anything you want to add to what we've discussed already tonight and what you've set out?
Well, it is probably worth noting appropriate humility. So the current hypothesis I have for the development of the Exodus tradition, I'm not going to claim that this is something that all Bible scholars believe, and I'm just repeating what they're saying. This is my current assessment of the evidence, and is very plausible to change with continuing investigation, discussion. This is my best attempt to put together a narrative for how the tradition developed, but I still need to go and have many other experts change my mind or adjust what's going on here. This is going to be an amazing touch point for discussing things, but we're not going to have a final word on exactly how the tradition developed. What we will be able to say, though, I think very solidly, is we can be extremely confident that this story did not happen, and it's just now going to be interesting to describe how the story itself got created.
Yeah. So the absolute, benchmark, not the starting position. I mean, the conclusion of the book project, as we've seen it, but of all the evidence out there, is that historically the Exodus account didn't happen. Moses didn't exist, certainly in the way purported to be the case, but in the Bible. Like, that much is definite. Like, there's no historical grounding for the Exodus account. So then, as you say, the question is, well, then what explains that story? How did it develop? Was it made out of pure cloth, or what? Can we map a development? Can we map a development external to the Bible? Can we map a development internal to the Bible? And that's interesting. And you've shown us that actually a little bit of both going on there. So we can see elements of a development of the story within the Bible, and then taking elements possibly from outside the Bible, assimilating that all together with the function of giving an identity to the people in exile, and eventually, so on and so forth. A bit of this, bit of that, shove some sprinkles on top, and a bit of strawberry sauce, and you have the Moses story as we now see it in the Bible.
Not so much strawberry sauce. You're going to need gefilte fish.
Sorry?
Gefilte fish. If you go to a Passover Seder, you're going to have to deal with that.
Yeah, but probably strawberry sauce, though, really.
No, bitter herbs. That's what you're going to have.
I think you find herbs. Americans still can't speak proper. So anyway.
Oy vey. I've only been to one Seder. I've only been invited to one. So what is the most authentic modern Jewish pronunciation of herb? I cannot tell you.
I can. It's herb. Definitely herb. Anyway, thank you very much, Aaron. It's been eye-opening, really interesting, and it makes me realize how much work I've got to do to get my head back into the world of biblical exegesis and theology and history and archaeology and.
Indeed, this book is many, many ands.
True that. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, Mitch, that's super kind of you. Thank you, mate. Like, Mitch is
yes.
nothing if not an absolute legend. Great stream, super interesting content. Appreciate it. Thanks, JP and Aaron and Lex Later. Phenomenal presentation, Aaron, and great questioning, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Actually, Lex has said previously that when we do write the book, he would definitely like to look it over for editing. He's great at editing and helping out with that. So I've had great experience of him looking over stuff before. So that's really great, Lex. Appreciate that.
I will definitely need that because, like I said, when I first tried submitting my article, the original editors or reviewers of that questioned if I was a native English speaker. So please look over it and tell me how bad I wrote.
That is a burn. That is a serious burn.
Yeah.
So what part of Austria are you from?
I'm going to blame it. I mean, I have been learning Chinese, so maybe that's why. 但是我的中文非常不好.
Yes, twice at least, or 74 or something. No, thanks, mate. I really appreciate that, and thank you very much to everyone else for being a part of this stream. Aaron, let's do this again sometime. It gets me out of thinking only about Ukraine, which is an obsession I have at the moment. So I appreciate that, mate.
All right. Well, in that case, das vidania, slava Ukraini, and very good night to you, sir.
Carry on, slava. Look, mate, stay on the line. Thanks, everyone else. Take care, everybody. Toodle pits.